This video is an introduction to an essay I've written titled The Potential of the Human Heart. The essay explores some of the big questions humanity has always had about things like love, goodness, meaning, and identity. We have common notions that there is a connection between these things, that love and goodness bring life to its best and most meaningful, yet there remains a clear disparity between the goodness that we can envision humanity might be capable of versus the strife and division we tend to see. And so my focus is on personhood and relationship at the individual level to try to clarify this potential for love and goodness so that we can bring it more fully into realization. There is an obscurity to life, a difficulty in fully understanding ourselves and in expressing what life means to us. My effort has been to deeply consider these difficulties of self-understanding and mutual understanding in order to pierce some of that obscurity, to make certain parts of human reality more explicit and tangible. In our common notions and intuitions about love and goodness, we understand that we want life to be about pursuing growth and connection, entering into possibilities of deep beauty, solidarity, and purposefulness. We can recognize, even in our own lives, a disparity between the promise life seems to offer and what we often end up experiencing. My thought is that the less obscure we make the nature of love and goodness, the more clearly we depict what human flourishing consists of, then our individual and collective paths to flourishing become easier to define and approach, and we can better address the disparity and the longing for deeper fulfillment. My goal of clarifying love and goodness, then, is to understand what practically makes a person capable of being good and loving, what that consists of in daily life, and what prevents us from seeing this and living it out. I address some of the barriers that keep us from approaching these things, barriers to acceptance and open-heartedness. This involves psychological and moral integration, the processes of finding peace and resolution in how we think and feel about life, and growing in virtue as a form of responsibility. I consider all of these things in reference to individual context, our particular history and unique qualities, the particular people in our lives. To that end, I'll share some of my own story, some trials I've experienced and learned from. All of this becomes concrete within our individual narrative. Engaging that narrative through our mental and emotional interior life, learning to accept and best direct ourselves, is how we become most capable of making love and goodness manifest, not as a cliché or platitude, but in a real way that makes all the difference in people's lives. Learning to face ourselves in this way is a matter of whether we fully live out our own personhood with an integrity in which we can be honest and at peace with ourselves and our conscience. In many ways, this involves being able to have what we could call the real conversation with each other, to get past the superficiality in our lives and address the things that we haven't been able to bring out into the open, to become present to each other and really share ourselves. It's as when we are able to finally say to someone, "I've had things on my heart to tell you." The things we have on our hearts to tell each other are often things we've carried for years, maybe even a lifetime. To tell them, "I'm afraid we're going to spend our lives missing the opportunity to have a relationship." You can imagine if you regularly started talking deeply with someone, sharing about why you love the things you do, what you hope for, how you feel about life and yourself, and how difficulties affect you. Imagine what your relationship would be in just a few years. This characterizes the deepest kind of friendship and trust. We can't have that kind of intimacy with everyone, in fact, only with very few people. But we can work to become the kind of person capable of unreserved kindness and acceptance toward everyone, to try to see and regard everyone most deeply, to see that they might have that kind of friendship with someone, that they could be seen by another as someone who can be cherished, and that they would see themselves that way too. It is as though each person's heart and mind represents vast unexplored territories, which, rather than explore, we stick to the safety of what is known. This is how we act in society, with strangers, to meet each other only in passing. To do this with those who have been placed most intimately into our lives, to continually talk past each other, even for years and years, is to miss the opportunity to be immersed in our full humanity, to celebrate, to honor, to serve each other. And so I'd like to start by examining love and goodness in different aspects, as quality, capacity, and action. As quality, love and goodness are part of what a person is, a person's being lovable, as having value simply for being human. This is at the bottom of what we try to nourish in each other, the fulfillment of our being and our life as something good in itself. To care for someone is to try to help them experience and understand their life to be a good for them, a real good, to be received and cherished by them as a gift, to see their life as a gift to share with others. If we believe that people have inherent value and dignity, this is an attempt to get to the source of that, to see how far we can push our belief in it. As capacity, love and goodness are how we are able to be intentional in giving and receiving, how we can have reciprocity by seeing others more clearly and completely. Growth in this capacity is a central theme throughout the essay. The ways that the integration of our personhood frees us to direct our intentions, to act and relate more authentically and wholeheartedly in compassion. And as action, love and goodness are a relational conduit, a way to communicate and form friendship through our treatment and regard for others. In all these things, love and goodness pertain to our identity. They form the fundamental principles of wholeness, of individuality, and of authentic relationship. The more that they are built up in us, the more inclusive we are able to be of our own self. Love and goodness enable the healing process of becoming open to ourselves in our entirety, more fully accepting and embracing the person we are. This further enables the desire for others' flourishing. The more we truly love ourselves and can receive love, then we are able to extend that love and acceptance to others. There is a strong relationship between the ways in which this is enkindled in us as individuals and how it is brought into mutuality. In this, we're seeing love and goodness as both aimed at the heart of the person and fully inclusive of the person. As our capacity for love and goodness grow, these qualities deepen and expand. We love more essentially and more encompassingly. Love desires to build up and be in relationship with a person for who they really are, not as a persona or image. Love disarms the need for facade. It seeks to affirm our essential identity as something good in itself that doesn't need to be artificially compensated for. We don't need to earn our value as a person. This is distinct from the ways we build trust in relationship by showing ourselves to be trustworthy, and the ways we become easier to love by acting lovingly towards others. But as we strip away the artificiality, it is more fully ourselves and not a projection that we offer as a basis for relationship. This real self, this essential self, is what we're getting at as we peel back some of these layers that cause much of the obscurity about meaning and relationship. This is much of what I'm referencing when I use the terms love and goodness, as having principles of integrating and unifying us in authentic identity. All of this ties into the picture of human flourishing and fulfillment. If we think of the most admirable kind of person, not admirable in fame or power, but admirable in their personhood, it's the one who is most capable of loving, who truly desires and fulfills the good for themselves as well as others. It's important to envision what this would be for ourselves, what our life would look like if we were that kind of person. Picturing ourselves as truly fulfilled in daily life includes being at peace with our conscience. That comes from living into a specific kind of self-acceptance, a belief that we are capable of good-heartedness, that in fact we have a fundamental goodness within ourselves that informs our identity, informs how we wish to live and view the world. I think this desire for goodness and belief that we can become truly good, or the question of whether we are fundamentally good, characterizes much of the conflict and complexity within humanity. When we give over to the desire for goodness, when we forgive someone or disentangle ourselves from vice, it is a giving over to the freedom of who we really want to be. For many of us, the peace of a free conscience turns out to be the very thing we've always wanted, but which we find ourselves continually fighting against and distancing ourselves from. There are some important ideas and images that we can use to help clarify our concept of an open-hearted, loving person. One such image is that of a good friend. The first thing we usually think of in a good friend is that they are trustworthy, they have a grounded firmness of character. This becomes a sign for us that they genuinely find relationship with us valuable. In this, we see how relationship stems from our intentions, our interior regard for one another. The way we cultivate our dispositions and sensibilities makes all the difference in how we engage life, what we find worthwhile to spend our time on, and how we end up interacting with others. And so, a large part of becoming the best kind of friend to others is in having the resolve to do so, the determination that we are going to live for what really matters, and that we are going to address and overcome the things that keep us from living as well as we can. Most of the time, we can recognize the things that are in our control to improve in our lives, perhaps ways that we live at a lower standard of health than is necessary. We may even recognize, on a certain level, underlying issues that we haven't addressed. Simple willingness, a change of heart, can be the most empowering thing. Sometimes that takes the form of willingness to get the help we need. On the other hand, without personal resolve of this sort, it is easy to take for granted what we might really have in our relationships. It's easy to take for granted that we can work to repair the ways we become distant and estranged from people, the ways perhaps in which we have lost warmth and tenderness with those we are close to. Oftentimes, with long-standing friends or family, we could be easily reunited if only we were willing to forgive faults or wrongs long past. A grudge we've held might be easily resolved if only one side were to initiate doing so. This is, of course, not so simple in every case. Maybe another person isn't willing to be reached. Our own hearts can have complexity in matters of forgiveness, even when we want to forgive but are hurt, or the other person really doesn't understand or doesn't seem to care. But there are many cases when our decision to give over to good-heartedness could make all the difference, when we know someone would respond if we tried to reach them. To do so is to step into a space where we can have that real conversation with each other, to encounter what each person really thinks and feels, to get to the bottom of what keeps us apart. We can be hurt from the ways our relationships involve distance, apathy, or resentment. But if we're honest with ourselves, what we desire from the people close to us is healed, authentic relationship. When we develop an adversarial regard for someone, we might ruminate on words of spite, something bitter that expresses the pain we've received from them. But what do we really want to say to each other? It could instead be a word of reconciliation that we carry around, that we wait for the opportunity to speak, to tell them, I miss you, I love you, I want us to have space for friendship again, I want us to forgive each other. The need for forgiveness is often mutual. The other person may be similarly hurt. They may be ready to forgive or ask for forgiveness, or it may at least be a starting point. We might be surprised at how quickly an old friendship is rekindled, or we may risk rejection. We have to determine how it is best to approach each other, or get help in determining so. But even the effort is a step toward the opening and disarming of our own hearts, towards a life characterized by approach rather than avoidance. These are, again, often very difficult matters, very vulnerable and requiring sensitivity and discretion. But it is the proposition of the heart that we face, the love and healing that may be really and truly available to us, literally in the sense that we could avail ourselves of it. Our feelings alternate in how these things can seem at one time close and palpable, and at another time distant. We may feel hopeful about connecting with a certain person, and yet the goodness we desire doesn't seem to translate. We can't quite reach them. We may experience fullness and expectation, followed by disillusion. This is part of the obscurity I've mentioned, that we can have a hard time seeing goodness or the possibility of goodness in life, even when we try to look directly at it. Here, it is helpful to consider the role that beauty has in our understanding of goodness. The beautiful moments in our life seem to take us above the ordinary. We see things with profundity and possibility. The most beautiful moments can imbue life with significance in a way that can even be transformative, that changes our whole outlook. I think part of what this is coming into our unique vantage point of cherishing. It is an experience in which the self finds harmony with its own act of appreciation. One aspect of beauty is the experience of something's goodness, and in one way we can lose ourselves in that experience, and it has a universal quality. But in another way, we find our particular self more fully alive through relationship to that goodness. In this sense, beauty provides the experience of having an identity that can receive goodness. It affirms that, whoever I am, I can partake of goodness. And I think this affirms something very fundamental in the underlying experience and meaning of our identity, that we can uniquely love and be uniquely loved as the person we are. In this light, beauty can show us some of what it is to be ourself, and perhaps what we could be as more truly and fully ourself. An experience of self is what we seek in our activities. The experience of goodness in various forms provides coherence and orientation to our identity. A life without goodness is lived as a kind of wandering. We hardly recognize ourselves in it. We may develop a sense of desperation to break out of the patterns that we find our life helplessly falling into. Goodness makes our very lives intelligible. Yet we are also prone to misunderstand or be misled by experiences that offer glimpses of fulfillment, but which turn out to be empty promises. It is important to understand the impact of experience on our felt sense of goodness and identity, so as to incorporate our feelings into deeper care and understanding, rather than being governed by different kinds of emotional substitutes for care. I get into that part of the discussion a little later. The goal here is to make the nature of experiences of beauty and goodness more overt and accessible. In my own experience, I found that thinking about beauty in these terms helps me know how to look for it, helps reveal an abundance of beauty that has a way of being hidden in daily life, in the seemingly mundane. Beauty becomes available, again in the sense that we can avail ourselves of it. It's important to see how uniquely experienced and held within our individual humanity this is. Beauty gives a presence to the possibility of our love. It provides the experience of something's goodness that invites our response. Within this, we can see that one of the primary principles of beauty is unification. It gives a certain form to that obscure connection between love, goodness, and meaning that humanity has always been trying to understand. And that form is the uniqueness of our personhood, that we each have a distinct identity from which to give and receive love. And so, beauty gives us a view into our own potential for love and goodness. The more that this becomes imbued into our thinking and relating, then we can learn to cultivate a responsiveness of valuing and cherishing things even in the absence of experiencing their goodness. We can live out a response to beauty more independently of our feelings and perceptions. Often enough, this will help foster the experience of and felt desire for those things, but our responsiveness can in fact go well beyond the immediate appearance and feeling of things to try to love and value people in the hidden depths of who they are. This idea of us having hidden depths is very much at the heart of my message. Getting closer to our core involves uncovering layers of hiddenness. If we ask ourselves, what does it mean to me to be the person I am? The answer isn't something that can be adequately expressed in words. Yet, the possibility and profundity that beauty signifies is the possibility and profundity of embracing ourselves in our totality. The image of an embrace is, I think, something of the deepest kind of expression of our meaning, our individuality. This is part of the individual vantage point of cherishing I mentioned, that only we can embrace what it is to be who we are. There are certain ways in which only we can know what it is to be who we are. We might tend to brush this aside because of the similarities of experience we share with others, but the singularity of our personhood is something that can become ever more pronounced, ever more our own, as we grow into ourself and develop and integrate our understanding, our psyche, our morality. Our identity finds expression more fully, more authentically, and more individually as we respond to our personhood with a more encompassing embrace. In this, we come to recognize and live into ourselves more and more deeply. It is as if self-recognition is continually rediscovered. I'd now like to share some of my own experience that enabled me to newly address and integrate parts of myself in the way I've been describing. In 2011, at age 26, I developed a neurological movement disorder called focal dystonia. Dystonia disrupts the brain's ability for muscular control, either generally or in localized body parts. In my case, it affects my right hand. This happened a year after finishing graduate studies in music composition with classical guitar as my primary instrument. Along with not being able to do daily activities like writing or typing normally, the condition is completely debilitating for something like playing a musical instrument. The impact this had on me at the time was devastating. My hand control deteriorated over the course of a few months. I didn't understand what was happening or why. It was just a mix of confusion, denial, and helplessness. As is understandably common with musicians in this situation, I developed depression. A few months after that, I lost a relationship that meant everything to me. The effect of breakups has a wide emotional spectrum. Sometimes they are barely upsetting, sometimes they are completely devastating. They are also such a common thing that for many people this may seem trivial to even mention. But this loss for me was profoundly more devastating than even the hand problem was. It happened suddenly and with almost no opportunity for resolution afterwards. The most difficult thing to endure was that, within less than a week of this happening, I experienced a psychological shift that allowed me to understand all that had happened, how developing focal dystonia had affected me, and many other things about myself. This kind of shift is common after high-impact emotional events, especially loss. It was transformative. I mention all this for a few reasons. The first is that, because relational pain is so prevalent, we have developed a cultural insensitivity to it. The grief of devastating heartbreak becomes disenfranchised by the dismissive or judgmental reactions of others. We need to be able to approach all of who we are and what we experience as not only fair but necessary to deal with honestly. But instead, we can defensively develop our own insensitivity to relationship to, understandably, inhibit a desire for closeness to others. Furthermore, it brings to light part of the nature of our psychological response to suffering. High-impact emotional events often precipitate psychological change, which can be very advantageous in removing blind spots from our perception, especially self-perception. The fear of loss, which keeps us from recognizing certain things or adapting, is ironically removed after loss actually occurs. But the problem for many people is that suffering or decline occurs or intensifies gradually, so that the necessity for change or adaptation isn't experienced as acutely. Also, without support or guidance, the advantage of high-impact psychological shifts is prone to backsliding. The momentum of resilience that is spurred by new perspective diminishes if the opportunities that such perspective may afford are not brought into realization. In other words, we might suddenly recognize hope or possibility or a pathway forward, but if that hope is met with disappointment, then we may lose some of our newfound resolve. In this, I would emphasize that, unless circumstances really warrant otherwise, it is important that people's hearts be given a chance to speak. The weeks following my heartbreak turned from some of the happiest days of my life, founded in great hope, to a crippling unraveling of that hope. Recovering from these storms, finding direction and healing at that point, were the hardest months and years I have lived. But this time also became in many ways the most beautiful. I wanted to love. I was in severe depression, couldn't sleep. I was sometimes anxious to the point of panic, and all I could do at times was endure. I didn't always do well. There were emotional extremes of despair or rage. But I knew that I believed in unconditional love. It was something of a tangible truth to cling to, something real and grounded beyond the daily struggle. If I was honest with myself even then as now, I knew that this was an opportunity to learn to love from a previously undiscovered area of my heart. The way these trials had revealed parts of myself to me was a real and lasting thing, which could make me more capable of entering into the heart than I ever would have been otherwise. Countless people suffer far worse, astonishingly worse. Within these trials, I had many resources and privileges, family and friends. I had come from and was working my way back to a normal life, with stability and freedom to pursue personal goals. I'm still dealing with dystonia, and it makes daily life difficult in certain ways. But with different personal capacities and circumstances in mind, I'd like to speak to a very specific and important part of what suffering means for us as individuals, which I think is part of the crux of whether suffering becomes either an occasion for bitterness and hardening, or for opening and, paradoxically, for healing. We have an importance to ourself that can't be fully communicated, that we can't articulate even to ourselves. Each of us has an intrinsic worth that we are living in relationship with, whether we are aware of it or regard it as such, or even when we feel a disregard, a low measure of our own value. This worth is something of our immeasurable humanity, unique in that no one else's life has the same qualities of love and of personal meaning. What we mean to ourselves has an intangible sense that only we can hold, yet that we want to be held dearly. The kind of pain that touches this core most directly is the experience of devastation. Part of the quality of feeling devastated is that we are hurt according to that incommunicable uniqueness of our life. The qualities of pain, and especially loss, are shaped by the irreplicable qualities of selves and the complex dynamics of our relationships. When we lose someone, they are lost to us in an individual way. The feeling is that no one else can have exactly who I had in losing a mother or father, wife or husband, sister or brother, daughter or son, and be me having lost them. This and other forms of devastation hurt as though the integrity of our particular self is undermined in worth, meaning, and purpose. It damages the sense that we are worth having hopes and having them fulfilled. But belief in our personhood as a gift is to continue to seek the self as a source of joy, to pursue a gladness at the self's presence. It is to take the opportunity to experience and to carry out our selfhood towards the purposes of good, even in trials that create a sense of separation from the self as good. Embracing life through this kind of difficulty is not a naive, untroubled embrace, but rather a response of courage. So I'd like to look at how to practically address some of the limitations in love and goodness we experience. I've given some of my broader depiction of what love and goodness consist of, getting to the heart of who we are, being in relationship through authentic identity, building each other up in that. We have desires for connection that we have trouble acknowledging and expressing. We have trouble seeing ourselves in the depth and fullness of our identities. How do we develop this comprehensive view of people that I've mentioned? How can we bring our deepest and most loving regards and intentions into daily life? I consider this through psychological and moral integration. These ideas are explored more in depth in the essay, and I'll also note that at the end of the essay, there is a section of recommended resources in literature and film that delve into these areas. The psychology of trying to understand a life comprehensively, and particularly our own life, happens on different levels. We tend to think of psychology as being concerned with developing insight about ourselves, addressing our feelings, processing difficult events, or resolving other kinds of internal conflict. It helps bring things from our life or our subconscious into view so that we can deal with them, find healing, be at peace, and move forward. It also enables us to change rigid ways of thinking or behaving and instead become more flexible and adaptable. For many people, this kind of interior exploration is familiar territory. For others, it can be very difficult to discuss these kinds of matters. We can be deeply wounded or ashamed in different ways, and emotional vulnerability poses a real threat. Some of the sources of anguish we carry are things about ourselves or things that have happened to us which have been completely beyond our control. Yet, part of the great lesson that suffering can teach is learning to appreciate and be sensitive to the anguish of identity which may be hidden beneath our exteriors. It is there in people more than it seems to be, in different degrees and different forms. We avoid highly personal matters for a reason. We compensate for the deepest acknowledgement and acceptance of our identity for a reason. That is often because we haven't found others who are willing to fully acknowledge and accept us for exactly who we are. Learning to receive love doesn't happen in isolation. The love we are shown by others, especially in early life, deeply impacts our sense of lovability and trust. And so, a large part of what I'm trying to draw attention to is the need, as well as the real opportunity, for us to help each other accept ourselves in the depth of our personhood. The more that we're able to enter into our own process of healing and integration in the experience of our identity, the more we can help foster this in others. All of this touches on a deeper level of our conceptualization of the human person. The way that we come to understand what humanity is in its essence is intimately connected to our internalized sensibilities, intuitions, and perceptions of personhood and relationship. In other words, we develop something of an internalized concept of human value and how each person has value and represents value. Like love and goodness, the essence of human value is not something to be understood in the abstract, but as having a reality that we can become capable of encountering. To do so, we must learn to interpret the ways in which our lives emanate from and give expression to deeper meaning, desire, and identity. To become more fully aware of and responsive to our deeper needs. All this may not be fully or directly communicable, but we are in relationship with it nonetheless, perhaps most tangibly through compassion. There is a lot to balance here. This certainly doesn't take place just in our experience or feelings. There is a unique complexity in each person's process of healing and learning openness and personal responsiveness. This development, this coming into our own humanity, has a beauty to it, which also characterizes and exemplifies the singular qualities of our individuality. When a person grows into being fully themselves, it is as though the process of their life increasingly takes on a relational quality. Their course of events conduces and corresponds to the maturation of their humanity. This is the picture of a person really learning to recognize themselves, to direct their personhood to its good, and to more directly treat and care for the personhood of others. The philosopher Iris Murdoch wrote, "Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real." Perhaps it is the other side of the coin to say that love is the extremely difficult realization that oneself is real. There aren't words for our deepest encounters with and realizations of our own humanity, and specifically the realization of our own existence. Reality hides in plain sight. It's far from obvious. It's a wonder that one of the most intimate things you can do with someone is simply to look at each other. Looking deeply into each other's eyes is something we usually reserve for those who are deeply in love. Yet we can come to see each person as capable of being cherished by another in this way. I said at the beginning that I hope to make certain parts of human reality more explicit and accessible, that we might more fully participate in it. But also I am hoping to make the reality itself so. I think sharpening the lens of personal narrative is critical in that this recognition and self-understanding must occur in a holistic way that includes healing. Humanity can only be properly understood in light of the goodness that brings it to fullness. We cannot see that from the outside. This principle must take root and begin to permeate our being. Taking steps towards this involves orienting our life within the context of what we've experienced, as well as the greater context of what human life consists of, particularly how we experience life through the mind. The specific context of our life history is the basis from which we develop our sense of self in relation to the world. This impacts the way we explore life and form our views and ideologies. The thing we have trouble understanding and appreciating is not just the connection between these two things, that is, the way our emotional and relational development impacts our views, but first of all, our personal development in itself. Our ideas about life are easy in the abstract. It is the meaning and experience of our particular humanity that is layered and obscure. Self-recognition involves bringing to light the ways that we can try to hide from ourselves, perhaps in the wrong we've done or hurt we've experienced. And as we enter more deeply into the reality of our personhood, we become more capable of seeing others with a similar wholeness and really appreciating that their personhood goes far beyond what is immediately presented to us. We can come to engage our personal narratives with the intention of bringing about in them this inclusivity and healing. This is on the opposite end of the spectrum from the amazingly superficial critiques, dismissals, and judgments we are prone to make towards each other. The world of personhood really is within us and all around us, yet we can be oblivious to it, not just due to selfishness, but often due to the hurt we've experienced, the ways we've been misguided into wrongdoing, and in our general limitedness. All this only emphasizes the need to reach each other. That is something humanity continually underestimates, the power we have as individuals to effect a transformation in others through love. This gets us into some brief considerations of morality. Most of my discussion on morality centers on it as a way of conferring goodness, expressing it, giving it form. We tend to focus on morality in outward actions, and that is certainly an important part of it. But first, I'd like to look at the connection between morality and the personal integration and realization that I've been speaking about so far. These things mutually inform and reinforce each other. Resolving or relaxing underlying psychological tensions frees us up to act as when we're at our best, and to encounter our humanity more deeply and engage it with meaning and purpose. Conversely, trying to live into notions of love and goodness has the effect of clarifying who we are and what we're about. If love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real, how better to understand the reality of others than by treating them as real, by treating them with love? How better to realize that we ourselves are real than by treating ourselves, the contents of our life, as though our love is an important contribution worth fulfilling, especially if we can make all the difference in the lives of at least a few others. Here we find that a basic principle of the moral good is that it clarifies and potentiates the relational quality of our identity, while moral wrongdoing obscures and weakens it. Participating in goodness increases its intelligibility. In other words, living virtuously allows us to better recognize and treat ourselves lovingly, whereas acting according to vice distorts such recognition and undermines the capacity for love. We can see this very evidently when people become morally divided or corrupt. We become very suspicious of others, not allowing real trust. We become very coarse to our feelings. There is one particular moral area I discuss in the essay, but for the most part, I look at it in terms of daily relationship. That is where we encounter morality most commonly. Most of our moral decisions are found in small matters of conscience, to choose what is best for others and ourselves. Again, virtue builds on itself and refines our will and understanding in such matters. There are certainly important and difficult larger moral questions, any particular one of which could be a separate issue of discussion. My thought on developing mature moral understandings is that the way we hold our views must be considered within personal context, just as I have been doing. Moral views have a relational significance for us that cannot be abstracted if we are to fully understand our reasoning on them and to account for our biases. The more psychologically and morally integrated we become in our personhood, it allows us to cooperate and converge on even difficult questions about the good. If we are to pursue goodness as a principle together, we cannot lose sight of each other. Pursuing virtue, though it may seem trivial in small ways and requires discipline, is not work towards morbid rigidity, but of the light-hearted relinquishment of the many burdens of immorality we acquire. The seeming triviality itself brings up the point of our commitment to goodness for its own sake, and how acting against our conscience in small ways has the effect of a subtle subversion of our respect and desire for goodness. I think this can be best seen not from the entrenched vantage point of adulthood, but from stepping outside of what become ingrained sensibilities on such matters. Here, it is important to think about how our process of moral orientation changes from childhood into adulthood. Our moral intentions, as we transition out of childhood, imperceptibly shed their naivety. Unwitting early moral compromises are often the beginning of how we come to lose the orientation of ourself as good, as a principle that informs our intuitions about our relationship with the rest of life. Very young children have a way of construing relationship with an implicit sensitivity to goodness and fairness. Children act selfishly in small matters, but they know it is right when things are serious. This way of engaging each other is something to be learned from and recovered. The care we offer each other need not diminish with age, so long as we can look past a person's exterior and see the vulnerability, the fragility, the child present in each person. It parallels all the ways in which humanity doesn't recognize the love it merits, the daily opportunities of small moments to act on love, and how missing this contributes to the world being the way it is, rather than the much better thing it could be. And so I hope these reflections will help people to foster new depths of love, to rebuild relationships and communities in seemingly small but vitally important and meaningful ways, with renewed hope and energy for the good.